You might think you know Thanksgiving. A family table, a roasted turkey, a story that begins with pilgrims and a single friendly feast. Think again. If you enjoy myth-busting history, stick around, subscribe, and like. The story of Thanksgiving is less a single origin than a long, messy conversation between cooks and politicians, between merchants and veterans, between reenactors and the descendants of people whose lives were changed by colonization. It is a holiday that gathered pieces from many different histories and stitched them into something larger than any one narrative. To understand it, you have to follow the food, the documents, the parades, and the people who kept pushing for a national day of thanks. On a cold November morning in rural Minnesota, the turkey barn smells of sawdust, warm feathers, and a tang of ammonia that the farmer calls simply barn air. Miguel Hernandez, who runs Harvest Ridge Farms with his wife and 2 sons, counts birds by eye as they move in a line along a low gate. He has raised turkeys all his life. He remembers how, as a child, the family's Thanksgiving table depended on a bird that had been out in the yard that morning. Turkeys are not noble animals, he says, laughing. They're messy, loud, and honest. That honesty is part of Thanksgiving's appeal, a direct line from barn to table that many Americans still believe exists. Dramatized recreation. Hay triples beneath a farmer's boots. Incandescent bulbs swing over rows of birds. A young boy reaches a hand to a warm breast as the farmer lifts the bird for inspection. The smell of corn mash drifts from an open silo. But how did a messy provincial practice become the anchor of a national ritual? The short answer is slowly, and for reasons that had less to do with one benevolent feast than with cultural work across centuries. Some pieces are culinary, pumpkin pie, turkey, cranberries. Some are political, newspapers, speeches, and a determined female editor. Others are spectacles, balloons on city streets, live television, and football games. The task is to distinguish the little truths from the big myths and to place the Wampanoag and other indigenous voices back at the center of a story that has often folded them into a decorative margin. Myth 1. The first Thanksgiving was a single, peaceful picnic in 1621 that looks like the family dinners of today. Reality. Records indicate that the 1621 gathering in Plymouth, described in a few contemporary letters, was a seasonal harvest gathering attended by colonists and Wampanoag people who had long practiced seasonal feasting. Edward Winflow's letter to a friend in England mentions a harvest celebration and the sharing of food. Historians note, however, that the letter is fragmentary, that it was written to reassure supporters, and that it says little about scale, ritual, or the balance of power. The Wampanoag were sovereign actors in their own world. They had protocols, obligations, and food traditions long predating the arrival of English settlers. To reduce the moment to an origin myth erases those continuities. At Plymouth Plantation today, costumed interpreters move through wooden buildings that try to evoke 1620s New England. The site has been a place of pilgrimage and education for nearly a century. Museum curator Anna Klein explains that the work of interpretation is twofold: to reconstruct the early colonial experience and to create space for native perspectives. Visitors come with expectations, she says. They want a neat story, but the material record is messy. We present what we can corroborate and point to where the story is uncertain. In the archive, a framed copy of a 1621 letter sits alternately as an artifact and as a symbol. It is useful, but insufficient as a foundation for a fully realized national myth. Food myths persist because food is immediate and comforting. The idea that turkey makes you sleepy has been a staple of post-meal conversation for decades. The medical myth about tryptophan from turkey causing drowsiness is one explanation people give. Nutritionists point out that the amount in a typical portion is similar to many other meats, and that what really causes post-meal lethargy is the sheer volume of food, carbohydrates, alcohol, and the body diverting energy to digestion. When nutritionists estimate the caloric footprint of a holiday meal, stuffing, casseroles, pie, gravy, they remind listeners that the meal is a physiological event as much as a cultural one. Other culinary stories are less about chemistry and more about invention. Pumpkin pie, for instance, did not arrive in 1621 fully formed as a lattice-topped dessert. Colonial cookery used pumpkins more as savory vessels or as mashed winter squash mixed with milk and spice. The sweet, pie-centric pumpkin recipes familiar today owe much to later innovations in American kitchens and the development of canned pumpkin in the early 20th century. Cranberry sauce, too, migrated from a native use of the fruit into a canned, gelled staple shaped by industrial food processing and marketing. Each dish on the modern table is a palimpsest: indigenous ingredients, colonial adaptation, industrial convenience, and 20th century advertising. The process by which Thanksgiving becomes national is not straightforward. For many decades in the 19th century, gratitude observances were local, seasonal, and often religiously inflected. New Englanders in particular observed days of Thanksgiving and fast through a Puritan tradition of giving thanks after harvests or military victories. In the world of print, a particular voice began to stand out. Sarah Josepha Hale, editor of a popular women's magazine in the mid-1800s, campaigned tirelessly for a unified national day. Her platform combined an appeal to domestic virtue and social cohesion. She wrote editorials, corresponded with governors and presidents, and framed a national day as a remedy to sectional divisions. Records indicate that Hale's petitions circulated widely, and historians note that her influence was significant because she connected her moral argument to a growing culture of domesticity and national identity. Dramatized recreation, a lamplit study, the clack of quill, a stack of magazines. A woman in a high collar pores over a letter from a governor, marking passages with a steady hand. "We need a day," she writes, "not merely to commemorate, but to reform public morals and unify a fractious nation." The political inflection of Thanksgiving deepened during the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln in 1863 proclaimed a national day of Thanksgiving, in part as a gesture toward healing the Union. The proclamation positioned gratitude amidst catastrophe, a rhetorical move to bind the nation through shared practice. Yet proclamations are political tools as much as spiritual ones. The holiday, as Lincoln envisioned it, could be invoked by government to cultivate national sentiment during a crisis. Later, in the 1930s and early 1940s, the date of Thanksgiving itself became a matter of federal debate. Franklin D. Roosevelt attempted to move the holiday earlier to lengthen the holiday shopping season, an action that sparked political backlash and, ultimately, a congressional law in 1941 that fixed Thanksgiving as the fourth Thursday in November. This legislative history reveals a recurring pattern. The holiday was continually shaped by economic, political, and cultural pressures. If Sarah Hale is emblematic of the holiday's domestic and moral framing, the spectacle of Thanksgiving belongs to a different set of actors: city planners, retailers, and television producers. Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, which began in the 1920s, started as a store promotion turned civic event. Balloons that now float above city avenues started as papier-mâché hot air, then as larger-than-life advertising images. The spectacle term captures more than marketing. It describes how Thanksgiving entered public space as a daytime parade, a broadcastable event with a visual vocabulary, balloons, floats, marching bands that would be replicated in malls, small cities, and high schools. On the parade route, crew members talk about the rhythm of inflation, the hiss of helium, the precise choreography required to shepherd gargantuan balloons between lampposts. Macy's archivist Rebecca Lawrence shows a faded photograph of the first parade, and she points out how quickly the event assumed national significance through media. "It became a ritual people associated with the start of a holiday season," she says. "There's a comforting logic to that, the visual sign that the year is turning toward winter and family." But spectacle has its costs. As the parade grew, so did the corporate stakes, and the event's meaning shifted from simple civic celebration to an engine of consumerism. For many Americans, Thanksgiving also carries a strong association with sports. College and professional football became a staple of the holiday schedule, a pairing that evolved through broadcast contracts, stadium traditions, and the availability of an audience at home. For veterans and families, football provides an emotional cadence to the day, a communal ritual that sits alongside the meal. Veteran Robert Ellis, silver-haired and soft-spoken, describes watching a game on a folding chair after a long day of travel. It felt like a bridge between service and home. You could relax for a little while. That bridge is part of the holiday's persistence. Rituals that anchor memory, parades, games, songs, reinforce a sense of continuity, even as history complicates the origin story. Complication grows when we center indigenous voices. The Wampanoag people, whose homeland includes present-day Massachusetts, experienced early interactions with colonists that were complex and consequential. Historians caution against a flattened narrative that depicts a single moment of harmony followed by unbroken descent into tragedy. The historical record shows negotiations, alliances, trade, and conflict, often conducted under asymmetrical pressures. Contemporary Wampanoag leaders insist that their history does not begin or end with 1621. Narragansett elder Amanda Peters, fictional name for illustrative interview, explains that indigenous communities maintain continuing cultural practices that Thanksgiving narratives often ignore. Our stories are living, she says. When people come to Plymouth expecting one kind of story, we push back. We want recognition of what happened and of what continues to happen. At commemorative sites, Indigenous representatives have increasingly demanded interpretive authority. Museum labels are being rewritten, new exhibits foreground Indigenous perspectives, educational programs pair costumed reenactors with contemporary Native guides who provide historical context and point out silences in the archives. These interventions complicate the celebratory script. They ask visitors to hold both a sense of loss and a sense of survival. The Wampanoag and other Native nations were subject to dispossession, disease, and violence, but they also adapted, resisted, and persisted. One letter from the early colonial period hints at the contact moment but cannot convey its full aftermath. Later legal documents, land deeds, state acts, and federal treaties record dispossession in ways that are more durable. When the narrator moves from a cozy reenactment in the living history village to a sober reading of a 19th century treaty, the tone changes. The paper is thin, the ink faded. A voiceover notes that changing land holdings and legal constraints redefined Indigenous life across generations. The legal narrative is technical and cold, but its human consequences were not. Loss of hunting grounds, pressure to assimilate, the imposition of new economies. This juxtaposition of convivial table and contested land creates a moral tension at the heart of Thanksgiving. The holiday's sentimental power rests on a picture of shared abundance. The same image can obscure structural inequalities that shaped how abundance was distributed. Recognizing both is not to demolish the holiday entirely, but to broaden what it can mean. Some families and communities have responded by incorporating acknowledgement into their meals, an opening that names the Indigenous land on which they gather, a moment of reflection that recognizes history alongside gratitude. Others engage with local tribes to support reparative projects. These practices are uneven across the country, but they signal an effort to reclaim moral coherence. Commercialization remains a driver. Retail calendars, Black Friday sales, early holiday promotions rely heavily on a Thanksgiving anchored at the end of November. The shifting date debate of 1939 to 1941, when business interests pushed for a longer Christmas shopping period, is instructive because it shows how cultural rituals are frequently remade to serve economic ends. Newspapers of the era carry editorials with both outrage and endorsement. Store owners argued that a longer shopping season would buoy local economies, while critics decried the manipulation of a civic ritual for profit. In the collage of archival clippings, the holiday emerges as contested terrain between public meaning and private commerce.
The journey of the turkey itself tells a parallel story of industrial transformation. In early colonial and frontier tables, turkeys were sometimes wild birds. Later, small farms raised them for local markets. The modern turkey industry, large barns, specialized breeds, vertical supply chains, reflect 20th century agricultural intensification. In the processing plant, conveyor belts and strict sanitation protocols replaced family slaughterhouses. Workers, often immigrants or migrants, became the unseen labor that turns a live bird into a packaged centerpiece. Documentary interviews in processing plants emphasize the sensory realities: the heat of the room, the mechanical hum, the smell of rendering. These details remove the mythic aura and reveal the material chain behind a familiar image. Dramatized recreation, voiceover, a family gathers around an early 19th century hearth. A different scene flashes to a modern packing shed, fluorescent lights, a timer beeping as birds move along a stainless steel table. There is also a political theater in presidential proclamations and popular culture.
When a president proclaims a day of Thanksgiving, it is not simply a personal religious statement. It is a public act that invites the nation into a shared posture. Lincoln's proclamation amid Civil War and Roosevelt's calendar decision amid economic crisis show how leaders use ritual to shape morale. Political actors have repeatedly repurposed the holiday, sometimes to heal, sometimes to stimulate, and sometimes to assert unity amidst division. At the center of the documentary's narrative arc is a recognition that myth is not always malicious. Myths perform social work. They offer coherence, provide moral exemplars, and simplify a complex past into something teachable. The danger arises when myth becomes the only story told, erasing voices and experiences that do not fit the tidy frame. It is possible to feel affection for tradition while also learning its complexity. That is the film's claim: to keep the warmth of a shared meal and to widen the circle of who is remembered. By mid-episode, the documentary shifts tone toward reflection. A scene lingers on a table's close-up, steam rising from gravy, the crystalline jiggle of cranberry sauce, a fork that pauses in mid-air. Voiceover slows. The narrator acknowledges the sentimental power of the day, how families return to rituals for comfort, how recipes carry memory across generations. Interviews with home cooks reveal the intimate logic of ritual. A grandmother's stuffing recipe becomes an heirloom, not because of any national story, but because of personal attachment. Veteran Robert Ellis returns in a later segment to talk about the holidays after war. He speaks of transportation, how service members would cram into trains, the rationing that altered menus, the ways a turkey could be both rare bounty and rare reminder of stability. "We didn't have everything, but we had the table," he says. "That table gave us a place to be human again." The small human testimony counterbalances larger historical claims, reaffirming that personal memory is a legitimate part of cultural history. Yet, the Wampanoag perspective remains an essential corrective. Contemporary Wampanoag leaders emphasize survival and cultural renaissance alongside the trauma of displacement. They call for educational honesty and for inclusion in how public history is narrated. Some museums now invite Native curators to design exhibits, while some schools incorporate indigenous histories into Thanksgiving lessons, replacing celebratory narratives with more complex accounts. These steps are not rhetorical. They alter how children learn about the past. As the documentary moves toward its climax, it threads together the 5 arcs: myth-busting about food and folklore, the messy history of 1621, the campaign to nationalize Thanksgiving, the spectacle of parades and football, and the living, contested memory shaped by indigenous communities. The climactic gesture is not a single revelation, but a revaluation, recognizing that Thanksgiving's endurance comes from its capacity to hold multiple, sometimes conflicting meanings. It is at once a time for family comfort, a site of national storytelling, an engine of commerce, and a place where historical injustice must be acknowledged. The resolution is careful.
The narrator refuses either to sanctify or to demolish. Instead, the final act invites viewers to practice a different form of gratitude, one that includes historical awareness. Practical suggestions emerge across interviews. Invite local tribal voices to community tables, read beyond the standard classroom narrative, support indigenous food sovereignty projects, and use the holiday as a prompt for learning rather than a full stop. Archival. A timeline appears, tracing Winslow's letter to Lincoln's proclamation, to FDR's legal fix. Each milestone is briefly annotated with historians' cautions. One letter suggests, records indicate, Congress set the date amid debate. The last scene of this segment returns to the turkey barn. Miguel walks among the birds, his boots sinking in straw. He stops, sets his hand on a broad back, and listens to the bird's breath. He is neither legend nor villain. He is the continuing, ordinary presence that the holiday depends upon. We raise them, he says, and people give thanks for them. That's enough to make it complicated. He shrugs a little. But it's also why it's worth thinking about. The documentary then poses a soft question to carry forward. If Thanksgiving has been many things to many people, what could it become if it took all those things seriously? The culinary history, the political maneuvering, the spectacle, and the survival. What would a season of thanks look like if it included reparative gestures? And honest education. In the next segment, the film will trace the legal and cultural debates that fix the holiday's date, explore how retail and broadcast industries reshaped its public life, and sit with indigenous elders who are reworking remembrance into living practice. But first, a look inside the Macy's archive and a visit with a Wampanoag Cultural Center to compare two very different kinds of public memory, the one made of helium and confetti, the other of ancestral drum and story. The reel of Macy's sketches unspooled like a secret language. In a dim, climate-controlled room a level below the street, a long table held pages upon pages of pencil outlines. Enormous animals in profile, annotations for seams and air valves, color swatches taped to the margins. Helen Marks, the museum archivist who had worked with the Parade collection for more than 20 years, guided a gloved hand over a drawing of a smiling cartoon turkey from the 1940s. Her voice folded documentary fact into a kind of gentle incredulity. These began as window ideas, she said. Holiday spectacle and retail display grew together. The balloon sketches are essentially merchandising in 3 dimensions. Imagine the storefront, but paraded through the city. She tapped a note. Tony Sarg, puppeteer, turns trade pageantry into mass entertainment. A folder of correspondence lay open. Telegrams arranging routes, invoices for helium and rigging, fan letters from children. A ledger from the 1930s recorded payments to mechanics and seamstresses who stitched the early inflatable characters. Passing between cases of yellowing playbills and black and white stills, the film lingered on an image of the very first Macy's parade. Employees in costume, a reindeer prop, children pressed to the curb. Helen's point was quiet but precise. What became a national ritual was from the outset a coordinated public performance designed to draw attention to a store and, crucially, to the idea of buying. Spectacle amplified civic calendar. Civic calendar amplified buying. The archive made tangible what historians had long argued in interviews. Thanksgiving's public life was not only a product of civic feeling, but of organized commerce. Department stores and later broadcast networks recognized an opportunity. A holiday could be ritual and revenue. Parades gave advertisers moving picture, and the images of helium-filled animals drifting down urban canyons served both wonder and market. Parade sponsors paid for visibility. Sponsors shaped what the holiday looked like on a national scale. Helen unfolded a brittle program from 1939. The notation in the margin recalled the year President Franklin D. Roosevelt moved the Thanksgiving proclamation earlier in November to lengthen the holiday shopping season. Outrage erupted in some towns. Newspapers ran cartoons mocking the change. The term Franksgiving appears there, penciled in by a clerk somewhere between Macy's and Washington. A page of clippings showed governors and mayors publicly refusing to follow the new date. Retailers were explicit, Helen said. They wanted more days between Thanksgiving and Christmas. They wrote to the White House. They lobbied. That's part of how a cultural rhythm becomes law. The documentary cut to a historian seated amidst stacks of economic reports. He traced the arc. Lincoln's 1863 proclamation inserted the holiday into national ritual as a unifying device during wartime. For decades thereafter, presidents made annual proclamations setting the day. In 1939, the unusual shift sparked legal and political friction that would culminate in Congress acting 2 years later to fix the holiday's date. The historian emphasized the mixture of motives: economic recovery after the Depression, pressure from retailers, and the desire for national predictability. By 1941, he said, a political consensus opted for the fourth Thursday. Law codified practice. Commerce and civic ritual had negotiated a compromise.
From the glossy hall of Commercial Archive, the film moved, abruptly, without rhetorical flourish, to a low, cedar-framed building by a pond where a Wampanoag Cultural Center keeps its doors open to teaching and ceremony. The air here smelled of wood smoke and drying herbs. The contrast could not have been sharper. Confetti and helium on one side of the story, drumskins, corn, and the quiet work of tending memory on the other. Inside, Elder Ruth Peters unrolled a basket of dried corn, its kernels multicolored like small beads. Children sat on carpets while she spoke. "We do not oppose giving thanks," she said. "We oppose forgetting." Her hands moved with the practiced economy of someone who has prepared many meals and many lessons. She told a story about planting, how the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, support one another in a garden and in teaching. "Our gratitude is tied to responsibility," she said. "You thank by tending. You thank by remembering who fed you first." The Cultural Center staff had, in recent years, been intentional about reclaiming what public memory had obscured. They ran workshops on indigenous foodways: how to cultivate heritage seeds, how to store corn in cool, dry places, how to preserve acorn flour, and the techniques for drying fish. A young organizer described a harvest table program that partners elders with local schools, bringing children to the land to learn how to plant and prepare traditional dishes. "We want people to understand there are ways to celebrate that don't erase us," she said. "Hospitality is part of our culture, but so is teaching the truth." That truth, in the interviews gathered for the film, was layered. Some Wampanoag speakers insisted that public remembrance must include the names of deeds and dispossessions, treaties broken, land taken, language endangered. Others emphasized survival and innovation, tribal enterprises that produce food, youth programs reviving language, cultural exchanges that invite non-indigenous neighbors to learn. There was also a consistent refrain about agency. The community wanted to shape its own presence at any communal table, not be an afterthought in textbooks or museum placards. A scene at a community meal crystallized both the difficulty and the possibility of inclusion. The table was long and plain. No parade balloons, no corporate insignia. On one end, a Wampanoag elders said a blessing that acknowledged ancestors lost to disease and displacement. On the other, a group of college students, some indigenous, some not, passed platters of roasted squash and beans. Conversation moved carefully between story and food. At one moment, a non-native participant asked how to approach Thanksgiving in a way that honors rather than erases. "Listen first," the elder replied. "Invite us to your table, yes, but also ask why we matter beyond being a token in your meal." The film juxtaposed these intimate scenes with archival footage of parade crowds, radio announcers, and department store windows lit like altars of consumption. The montage made a case. Public memory is forged both by what is spectacular and by what is taught at kitchen tables and community centers. Those who control spectacle have a head start in shaping national imagination. Those who teach at the grassroots labor to complicate it. As the documentary threaded forward, it returned to the legal history to show how ritual and market found legislative expression. In 1941, Congress passed a joint resolution that fixed Thanksgiving as the fourth Thursday of November, and the President signed it into law. The decision did not erase debate. It crystallized a compromise that reflected the political and economic stakes of a mid-century nation preparing for war and seeking domestic stability. The archival record showed letters from merchants pleading for a longer shopping season, op-eds from small newspapers denouncing the change, and a map of states that, for a time, refused to comply. Historians on screen argued that this legislative moment was not merely a technicality. It was an instance in which commerce, media, and government together shaped the rhythm of civic life. Fixing a date may sound mundane. In practice, it standardized a cultural beat that broadcast industries and retailers could plan around. Parades became appointment television. Retailers organized sales that hinged on the fixed day. That standardization, the film intimated, amplified some voices and marginalized others. Back at Miguel's turkey barn, the camera caught the late light sliding through rafters, dust motes drifting like confetti of another sort. Miguel tied a band around a bird's leg, a motion he had made 1,000 times, a small choreography of care and control. "People want a simple story," he said. "We give them a turkey and a meal. But the story behind the meal, who raised it, who learned to cook it, who paid for the table, complicates that simplicity. The question is what you do with the complication." The film left that question open but insistently practical. If the calendar is fixed by law and the parade is fixed by spectacle, then memory can be nudged by everyday acts. By who a community invites, which histories a school chooses to teach, what projects receive support. The legal fix of 1941 mattered because it made some forms of holiday planning predictable. The countervailing work of remembrance mattered because it insisted that predictability not become erasure. A montage closed the segment. The Macy's sketches folded back into boxes, the drum at the Wampanoag Center was tamped gently with a beater, and a group of teenagers planted corn in a small patch of reclaimed land. Text on screen, annotated dates and decisions. Winslow's letters, Lincoln's proclamation, Roosevelt's controversial change, Congress's resolution, each milestone annotated with a historian's caution. Meaning is not monolithic, and legal dates do not settle moral claims. The film lingered on a single image to end this chapter, an elderly woman at the Cultural Center tracing the outline of a child's small hand with her finger, as if mapping lineage. Her words, soft and direct, closed the sequence. "We are here," she said. "You remember in many ways. Remember us as choosing how to give thanks, not only as those who suffered, but as those who continue." The shot held, and then the documentary began to follow new threads. How broadcast and retail industries reshaped the holiday's public life in the television age, and how conversations about reparative gestures and educational reform moved from kitchen tables into legislatures and classrooms. The next scenes unpacked those transformations, starting with the rise of mass broadcasting and the ways it turned local spectacle into national ritual. Television, the documentary suggests, did not merely transmit images. It condensed time and place into an agreed-upon present. Where local parades once belonged to neighborhoods and their particular loyalties, broadcast turned them into common property, an annual ritual that millions watched at once, imitating the same facial expressions in living rooms from Maine to California. The film cuts between families gathered around cathode ray screens, laugh lines and small anxieties catching in the flicker, and the mammoth production meetings at networks, where parade routes were debated alongside camera angles and sponsor slots. A narrator notes plainly, "What is seen on screen becomes easier to remember than what is lived in the kitchen."
With the routinization of televised spectacle came new business logic. Retailers learned to shape a calendar that viewers expected. Producers learned to stage narratives that could be compressed into 30 and 60 minutes. The documentary places side by side the cheerful engineering of a holiday special, chefs demonstrating a perfect bird, hosts handing out trophies of gratitude, and the less tidy persistence of neighborhood rituals, a potluck table in a church basement, a family thanking quietly for a roof. They taught us how to look at each other, a historian says. They taught us how to applaud. But the camera returns persistently to those who refuse to be only an audience. Across the film's later sequences, educators and activists appear in close shots, each offering a different tactic for expanding national memory. A Boston schoolteacher speaks about revising a unit on early colonial history. We stop teaching Thanksgiving as arrival and start teaching it as consequence. We teach maps of displacement alongside maps of settlement.
At a rural museum, a curator unboxes letters and photographs from a donation chest, items that complicate postcards of the first feast, petitions, ledgers, lists of names that reveal patterns of tenancy, servitude, and survival. The Wampanoag Center re-enters the frame with a longer scene. Teenagers, hands dirty with soil, take turns hitting a drum while an elder watches, smiling without sentimentality. "It's not a monument," she says to the camera. "It's daily." Their work, planting, teaching language classes, making space for ceremony, functions in the film as both repair and insistence. Repair because it attempts to redress erasure, insistence because it refuses to let a single image stand for a complex history. Miguel appears again, older in the waning light, loading a truck with birds bound for a community meal that will include people from the center and the neighborhood shelter. He ties another band around a leg without show. The motion reads now as belonging to the moral architecture the film has been tracing. "We feed each other," he says. "We remember who is left out if we don't." The documentary does not pretend that policy follows conscience easily. There are scenes of school board hearings where parents spar over curriculum language, of small town councils debating whether to allow a land acknowledgement plaque at the town square. Footage of a senator proposing funding for cultural education is cut against footage of a classroom where a child's question, "Did they always have to fight?" hangs in the air like a bell. A teacher answers, without grand gesture, "No, and that's why we learn it." In its penultimate montage, the film alternates close-ups, a ledger's inked names, the drum's skin, the slow puff of a turkey's breath in the barn, the folded program from a televised parade. Over these images, a simple proposition emerges. Public ritual and private memory are not independent streams, but braided ones. Where law and market set a wide current, grassroots work alters the course incrementally, by what is taught to children, by who is invited to the table, by how a community insists on being seen. The sequence ends with the cultural center's elder tracing another small hand. The same image as before, but now the frame widens to include the teenagers planting just beyond the window. Outside, a placard nailed to a reclaimed fence lists the names of families who tended the soil for generations. The camera lingers on the list as a voiceover, neither accusatory nor triumphant, concludes, "Memory is kept where people live it. The law can fix the date, the networks can set the picture, but the work of remembrance is made at the table and in the dirt and in classrooms where we teach each other to ask different questions." A last, quiet scene prepares the viewer for what follows. At a small public access studio, a local producer rewrites the script for a community broadcast that will showcase both a parade clip and a segment on indigenous gardening. He folds a photocopy of a Winslow letter into the pile beside a map of planting seasons and, without fanfare, makes a phone call. "We'll run them both," he says. "People need to see both." The camera stays on his hand as it hovers over the desk lamp, then moves to the window where the teenager's corn patch gleams green under the November light. The documentary holds on that patch until the frame darkens and the credits begin to roll. The lights come up slowly in the small theater. For a long moment, no one moves. A woman near the front presses her palms together as if holding something fragile. Applause starts, hesitant, then gathers force. Strangers clapping for strangers, for stories finally given the room to breathe. A few people leave without applause. A boy whose eyes are wet, an older man who folds his program as if it were a map he must learn to read. In the lobby, the filmmaker stands a little apart, accepting thanks with the careful disbelief of someone who has been present too long to assume applause will solve anything. The film slips into circulation in ways that surprise few and surprise some. A county art series books a weekend slot and fills the hall with folks who never go to festivals. A university screens it for incoming history students. A weekly cable access program folds the footage into its community news hour, just as the producer promised. At each showing, there is a conversation. Sometimes a formal panel, sometimes a circle of chairs where people pass a microphone, sometimes a teacher who brings a class and watches how teenagers squirm and then lean forward. At a town council meeting a few weeks later, the plaque debate returns. It is the same room where the earlier footage showed parents trading barbs over curriculum language, but the tenor has shifted in small, concrete ways. People who spoke only to talk now bring boxes. A ledger, the folded program from a parade, a packet of letters someone found in attic trunks. One by one, stories are read aloud. A retired farm worker stands at the podium and names the families on the fence placard. A high school senior, nervous and precise, reads a passage from the documentary that described how children learned to plant corn together. The council chamber, warmed by a late autumn sun, fills with the ordinary pressure of testimony. Not every meeting ends in agreement. There are days when the room cracks open into the same old divides, and the film is cited as proof by both sides. Proof of grievance, proof of healing. There are op-ed pieces that frame the documentary as an attack on tradition. There are op-eds that say it simply told what everyone knew, quietly, only now spoken. The filmmaker, who once worked the phone like the producer at the small studio, begins to receive invitations and complaints in equal measure. She learns to answer both. In schools, the film finds a different life. A middle school teacher in Boston reconfigures a unit. Maps of settlement and displacement set side by side. The ledger names used as entry points to math and to story. Students who resist history because it feels like accusation discover instead that history is made of neighbors and ancestors, of patterns and choices. One student, whose great-grandmother appears in the museum's donated letters, volunteers to help curate a display. Another asks, in class, whether remembering can be a kind of apology that keeps working. The teacher answers, as she did on camera, no, and that's why we learn it. The line circulates, quoted in a newsletter, repeated at a family dinner, painted on the margin of a school essay. Miguel's meal becomes an anchor for the neighborhood. What begins as a single evening, turkeys, bowls, the slow passing of plates, becomes, quietly, a monthly thing. The community shelter sends a list of names. The Wampanoag Center brings a dish and a handful of seedlings. Volunteers sign up to drive elders to the center. Teenagers who once came only for the drum work the food table without commentary, carrying pans with the same steady hands they use in the garden. A woman who attended the first screening shows up with a folding table and a box of donated jars. She says simply, "We can do this." So they do. At the museum, the curator's unpacking does more than alter a display. The ledger's inked names enter classrooms and legal archives, into genealogies of families both listed and omitted. A donor who once insisted the museum keep a tidy, celebratory narrative donates a sleeve of letters after reading a teenager's essay. The curator mounts a small exhibition where visitors are invited to write the names of those they remember on strips of paper and add them to a growing wall. The act is unglamorous and infectious. People pause, fumble, trace a name. The Wampanoag Center deepens its work in public life,
Not by grand statements, by scheduling more days of planting, by creating a rotating schedule so teenagers can teach language classes that occur before and after school. Elders shift modest expectations. Ceremony arrives in shorter, more frequent forms. The drum that once kept time in long rites now keeps time in the middle of a community meal. On a chilly morning, a boy whose family had once been invisible among the fence names stands at the edge of the corn patch and asks an elder, "Why do we keep doing this?" The elder smiles and says, "Because the soil remembers if we teach it to speak." Policy moves in fits and starts. A senator's bill to fund cultural education, seen earlier in campaign footage, wins a small appropriation in committee. It is not the sweeping change some hoped for, but it is real money for pilot programs in rural districts. A school board adopts a new lesson guide after a narrow vote. The victories are procedural, incremental, a curriculum update here, an additional class offered there. The documentary is credited sometimes and blamed sometimes. Its role is to make visible what already existed and to nudge institutions toward naming it. Resistance does not disappear. There are angry calls, signatures circulated, a late-night commentator who frames remembrance as subtraction. But the film has done something subtler than convert an opponent. It has rearranged where questions can be asked. Conversations that once took place only in private kitchens or at kitchen tables now happen in public, often awkwardly, sometimes painfully, and the awkwardness itself becomes a part of the work. People learn how to speak across discomfort. They learn how to listen. The last shots of the documentary, which lingered on a list of names and on teenagers planting, give way in life to similar, less staged scenes. A child tracing ink with a smudged finger in a museum light. A volunteer hammering a small plaque into a fence. Miguel loading a second truck of food, this time with a neighbor learning how to tie a band around a turkey's leg. There is no triumphal end, no tidy reconciliation. Instead, there is the persistency of the ordinary, the daily practice of tending, naming, teaching. The film's influence is not a decision, but a rhythm. It returns to the places it documented, schoolrooms, the center, the museum, through follow-up screenings and visits. The camera records a teenager teaching a class in Wampanoag. It records a teacher who has changed a lesson plan, and then, years later, sends an email from a parent thanking her. The ledger is digitized and then handled, carefully, by hands that know how to read spidery ink. The plaque is installed with names that were debated for months. Some people still object, but more come to see the list and stand quietly before it. On a late afternoon, as the light thins over the community garden, the filmmaker sits with the elder who once traced the child's hand by a window. They watch teenagers bending over rows of green, small and determined. The elder sets a palm on the drum, then on the soil, then on the list nailed to the fence. "We keep it," she says, without flourish. "We keep remembering where we are. That's the work." The filmmaker folds her notebook away. The camera, having followed the public and private entanglements of memory, pulls back to a wider frame. The garden, the fence, the town beyond it, people moving about like timekeeping. The breath of the place is neither victory nor defeat. It is a roster of choices made, again and again. Teaching, naming, feeding, opening the ledger, listening. Memory, the film suggests, and life confirms, is less a monument than a habit. Outside the garden, as November moves toward winter, a small group gathers to stir the last embers of the season. Leftover food passed from hand to hand, seedlings wrapped in newspaper for spring. The camera lingers on a folded program, on a pair of gloves, on a child's small fingers planting one last seed in the darkening earth. The frame holds until the light finally goes, and the scene becomes a memory in itself. A moment kept because people choose, day after day, to keep it.